right, so excited to be hosting everyone today for the webinar. My name is Carlos Vega. I'm the co-founder and CEO at Tesorio. We focus on cash flow performance. We built a cash flow performance center where you can plug in all of your cash inflows, outflows, and bank data to orchestrate your cash flow and take action on it. Make sure that you're getting paid on time, cash is only leaving at the right time, and you have a good visibility into your short-term cash needs. With us today, we've got Sid from SpendFlow. Thank you for being the main host here and bringing us all together. And Dan Fletcher from Planful. The title of the webinar, just as a reminder, Fintech and modern CFO, optimizing cash flow and spend management. Before we kick things off, I want to turn it over to you all for introductions. Sid, you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for joining us, Carlos and Dan. So I'm Sid, I'm the co-founder and CEO of SpendFlow. At SpendFlow, we're an all-in-one SaaS buying and management solution. So we help companies get visibility into all of their SaaS spends, automate their entire buying and renewal process, and get them guaranteed savings along the way. But I'll hand it over to Dan now to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Sid, and hello, Carlos, and hello to all the attendees. I'm Dan Fletcher, as Carlos said, CFO of Planful, and we are a leader in financial performance management. But practically what that means is planning, financial close, reporting, budgeting, and analysis.
Excellent. Yeah, so excited today to dive into a lot of, a couple of different topics. Obviously very focused around cash flow and spend management, but that's just, surface for a lot of areas right now, especially in this market where cash is no longer free. There's no just ATM in Silicon Valley on Sand Hill, right? And the cash not being free, the counterpart is interest rates are up, which is positive for being a little bit more conscious about what kind of returns and what you're doing with your cash and cash balances. So before we dig in to a lot of the meatier areas, it would be great to hear from you all, at a high level. Fintech has been happening for a while. Obviously, it's not the latest. ChatGPT is obviously generative AI, and we will cover those topics, is at the top of everyone's mind these days. But we've been exposed to fintech for some time now, and the role of the CFO has been evolving, right? Folks that grew up with iPhones, around them, and so more modern technology are now stepping into more and more senior finance roles, and so have different expectations. What you can do is also changing. So it'd be great to hear, maybe Dan, starting with you as a CFO today. How has this role evolved, right? What are your priorities? How have they changed now that you can do more with your role?
Yeah, certainly, Carlos. And so, you and I have been on webinars before together, and as have Sid and I talking about this very thing, and yet it keeps coming back to the forefront of content, right? And that's the topic of tech for CFOs or fintech, and there's a little overlap there. And so the question is why? Why are we still talking about this, and why haven't we moved on to process optimization or LLMs or Gen AI is the lead topic, Carlos? And I think it's just because it's still happening to us. So CFO tech was late to the party. You had ERP way back in the 70s, but then it was all sales and marketing tech and e-commerce, et cetera. And CFO tech was out there, but was sort of a fifth or sixth wheel, a lot of on-prem legacy tools. And where we are today, the reason there's so much buzz around our space, or probably dating myself, but in Zoolander, one of the characters says, "So hot right now." CFO tech is so hot right now because, well, investment has poured into it and it's catching up. And so you have the three vendors on this call, for example, Carlos, are all on the bleeding edge of incorporating AI into our platforms, purpose-built apps, et cetera. And so I think it's very warranted that we're still having this conversation. In terms of how the role has evolved, I just think the role of the CFO over the past 15 years has exploded in scope. You've got CFOs now who are managing data curation, data strategy, HR, IT, legal, deal desk, et cetera. So it's not just a recording of the debits and credits and preparing the financials anymore. This is not groundbreaking news, but as the role scope expands, I think you have to leverage tech to keep up.
I think I can just add to that as well. I think the major difference that I see in the last couple of years, the CFO has become the point guard and not the referee anymore, right? Dan and I had a conversation on this as well, where CFO used to come in at the last minute and say, blow the whistle and say, you can't do this because of X, Y, and Z, right? But now the CFO is now responsible for getting the data to the right person at the right time to make the right decision, right? So they're the enabler, or like they're the ones who are actually pouring fuel into the organization to make sure that it's all running smoothly. So, and they have the best vantage point to make this happen. At the end of the day, the CFO has visibility into cash, it has visibility into collections, spend, and revenue, everything at once. So they actually have an amazing opportunity to redefine that role in the coming decade. Actually, and like Dan said, it's still just happening to us, and so it's a long way to go.
That's awesome. I love the ref to point guard. I joke around internally. It's they're no longer the bouncer; they're the DJ at the party now. It's funny because like I find, so my background, I spent a decade in finance before, but I was doing M&A. I wasn't like an operating CFO, but like I was our de facto finance guy at Tesorio until like last year when we hired Max, our VP of Finance and Operations. And it's really interesting. It's finance and operations, right? Like I think a lot of CFOs, even though they don't have the COO title, they're the de facto COO as well. I don't know, Dan, I in your experience, like what you're seeing, right? But it's like, yeah, it's totally all those areas we just talked about. And what I find is that the finance leader for me is like, it's the one other person that's completely objective from the day-to-day of what's happening in each department. So if I ever have to have a very objective conversation, that's my number one strategic thought partner on that sort of stuff. So it's pretty interesting to see then, given the changes in technology now, how that kind of accentuates that, right? And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, transitioning, Sid, I know you've been, SpendFlow like does some very exciting things around spend management, right? But like part of what enables this is the fact that everything did move to the cloud, right? So everyone knows their general ledger, but there's always been, tons of subledgers out there that were offline. Now the subledgers are also online and can be connected, right? So like, what are you seeing? Like what's SpendFlow doing in that area, right? In order to bring apart, bring together something, sometimes you call it like connected finance, right? Like bringing all these pieces together so you can have not just that visibility from like a responsibility standpoint, but even from a data and tools and actionability perspective.
Yeah.
You can share a little bit about what you've seen and what you see there.
Yeah, for sure. Like just for context as well, right? Like we've analyzed over $2.2 billion of SaaS spend data. So we have actually a great view into what's that CFO stack look like across different organizations. And we primarily work with CFOs. And what we really see is, I mean, we all know this, right? Like companies are using over 120 different SaaS tools. So that implies that the number of tools inside the organization is just going up. It's not reducing anytime soon. And the amount of SaaS spend in the organizations is also growing at 25% year on year. So some of the changes that have happened now are just realizing this. We've typically had a lot of human intervention in a lot of the financial processes, right? Like be it AP, be it AR, be it even spend, right? Like, but now with how connected these systems are becoming, CFOs are getting really smart. They understand at what point do I put in which system to actually automate a bit of my life, because otherwise they understand that hiring headcount for this is not going to be scalable. And we see CFOs actually doing this a lot more proactively, where they're actually buying systems much sooner, they're putting it in place much sooner, and they're actually going live with it and making sure they're actually connected with all the other systems that the organizations use, which is the most important piece. Just interoperability has become one of the key pieces within the organization, so that like you have your entire order to cash, you have your procure to pay, you have your hire to retire. All of these processes are now becoming interconnected within a lot of the companies that we work with. So I think that's what we're really seeing, and that explosion is reduced the amount of manual error, improved a bunch of the metrics that CFOs can now track. And for example, when we go to our board meetings, we're a lot more prepared now than we ever were, because we could just like pull up a dashboard and then everything is there. It's a live dashboard of all our metrics, and it's actually there. And now our finance leader internally is super proud about moving those numbers up in the right system. They're not really worried about scrambling for the data in the last minute. They're actually proactively moving those numbers up.
Yeah, that's like a good topic there. You know, like when you think about spend management and cash flow and what you just said around like having the time to focus on strategy, right?
Yeah.
And getting things right. Like when you zoom out, right, and you think about cash flow and spend management, all these things, right? Just to, go a little bit theoretical, right? Like enterprise values, the present value of future, discounted future cash flows, right? So the present value of future cash flows discounted today, is very different than like how much cash I have in the bank.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you at SpendFlow, right? Like it's interesting. I would love to hear your perspective, right? Because like a lot of folks will say like, hey, cash flow just takes care of itself, right? Yeah. Or they just focus on like, the bottom line. Like I just need to save this, and that's it. Or they focus on net terms. I need to get my DPO out to this number. But there's a difference between like one-time impacts and ongoing value creation. Yep. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, like given what SpendFlow does, the data you have access to, and all those things, like what are you seeing? How does spend management and cash flow, like where do they overlap? What's the nexus there?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Actually, in the last year, that overlap has become much more significant. Primarily because, like you said, money's not cheap anymore. So the cash in the bank isn't going to necessarily be reinfused every single year. So you need to figure out that the only way that's going to get reinfused is because of cash flow. And for that to happen, we have a lot of we had a lot of customers in the last year become really smart about it. They're actually tying their spend decisions to those cash flow decisions as well. And the only way they can do that is to get visibility into both. If they don't have visibility into when their cash flow is actually coming in, or they don't have visibility into when they're actually going to have to pay these bills, or when those renewals are actually coming up, or how much do I actually have to pay for the renewal, how many licenses I'm actually using, not using, what are the net payment terms, what do I have to actually benchmark. So it's actually a very holistic view that you really need in order to make these decisions. And to your point, Carlos, you depend on your finance team to have the most objective conversation. So in order for your finance team to have a very objective conversation, they need a picture of all of this. Right. Without that, you're going to ask them really tough questions and they're not going to have answers for it. So I think that's the key piece that we're actually seeing, is that like that holistic picture is now coming in place for the CFO.
That's super interesting. Dan, I mean, you remember like going back like 2 years, 3 years when we were doing webinars to get started, like we were trying to convince people that cash flow mattered. Now it's like everyone talks about cash flow. Can you maybe like share some of your experience, man? I mean, you started your career at like the cash flow like wizards, right? Like Alvarez and Marcel, like they get brought into like part of the 100-day plan, right? To like create a 13-week cash flow every time a PE firm acquires someone. Like I've never met anyone that understands indirect, direct, 13-week cash flow is better than you. Like maybe you can tell us a little bit about, your experience there, and obviously like knowing your cash balance and landing your cash balance is still important, but I would love to hear, your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, you're spot on that cash is cool again, but private equity has always known that, right?
Yeah.
That their cost of borrowing was very clearly known and articulated, and therefore PE is trying to optimize the amount of cash that they put on the balance sheet, the amount that they borrow to fund a business. And in order to do that, you need visibility. And Carlos, go back 10 years, the only way to get visibility into cash flow was spreadsheets. We account for our businesses on a GAAP or an IFRS basis, and there's a disconnect between accrual-based accounting and actual cash flow. And then from an indirect method, and I know we're getting wonky here, from an indirect method, there's also a lack of visibility into the true levers in a business. So for the audience, you have three financial statements. You have your balance sheet, snapshot in time that will tell you how much cash and working capital you have, income statement, which will tell you your profitability, and your cash flow statement, which will give you a high-level view of sources and uses of cash. That said, those are very bucketed, operating, investing, financing sources and uses. And when you go to run the business, that's not helpful. You don't talk to the marketing and say, hey, let's talk about your operating use of cash. No, you need to talk about programs and campaigns and headcount and ad networks, et cetera. And so, Carlos, I think, skated to where the puck is on this. Tools have been built to solve that problem, which is to solve the cash flow disconnect between accrual-based accounting and direct method cash forecasting. And that's what A&M did. One of the many things A&M does is what Carlos referenced, which is to build 13-week or 52-week cash flow models that will take a look at where you are today in terms of your AR and AP and accrued expenses, et cetera, short-term assets, and unwind them to cash, and then layer on your forecasting from a tool like Planful. Right. And so that is the most dangerous tool, makes you the most dangerous person, Carlos and I always say, in the business. You know where the rubber meets the road, where every dollar that leaves the business is going, when every dollar is coming in, and whether it's coming in on time, et cetera. So there's no question that type of visibility, Carlos, is now table stakes because of the cost of capital out in the ecosystem. But PE always knew that. And has been building those models for 3 decades now.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for that, man. You're like a wealth of knowledge with all your experience, man. Yeah. So, another question then, like, double clicking on this, right? Like, yeah, I kind of mentioned it in passing, right? Like the difference between cash flow and cash balance, right? Like, obviously it's nice to have a lot. It's like, as a person, it's like you always want your salary to cover your expenses. You don't want to be dipping into your savings, right? Like it's the same thing as a business. Sometimes people just don't see it that way. Like, oh, great, I raised a big round of funding. I don't have to worry about cash flow. It's like, it's not quite the case, and now it's like brought it back into focus. So like that leads into like, areas around like, okay, if you want to grow, you have to have a really good understanding of your risk, right? So you can have the right level of agility in order to be nimble in the market. So, I mean, Dan, just to pick on you again, I mean, I saw in the news, you guys had a pretty recent acquisition, in an area that literally is the growth engine, right? In marketing. So that's like super interesting to see a FP&A like planning tool, right? Like buy, really like literally invest money in acquiring a company in the marketing area, like, which is going to drive growth. So like you're like totally riding this, balance between risk and agility right there. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about that and how, how this is enabling your customers to grow and why you guys pursue this strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same reason, Carlos, that we are at Planful are happy Tesorio customers. It's the same reason that we have legal, CSM, account management, account executives, finance, accounting, all in Tesorio, which is our cash flow performance platform. What I'm trying to paint a picture of is it's very cross-functional. Financial performance is in fact cross-functional. And the history of our space, CFO tech and Fintech, is that the users were finance and accounting, procurement, collections professionals. And it wasn't opened up to the cross-functional users out in the business. And that was a early evolution. I would call it a mistake, but I think it was just a natural evolution. You start where the work happens and you branch out from there. And so what Carlos is referring to is this concept we have at Planful, that planning, financial planning, but planning generally, operational planning happens everywhere in the business. And really only finance has the specific tools to do that planning, which isn't helpful to marketing and to IT and to HR and to sales, right? Is that they don't have tools that are purpose built to plan their business. So you take marketing, for example, and I kind of already riffed on this, Carlos, but my CMO does iterative planning throughout the year, but at the beginning of the year is looking at the programs plan for the entire year. What are our goals? What messages are we trying to resonate with that are tied to our bookings goals? And what is the conversation we're trying to shape out in the ecosystem? And then you go down one level from those goals and you say, well, what programs and webinars like this one here, any live events do we need? What type of ad campaigns do we have to run? And then what type of headcount do we need to execute against all those programs? And then you get into, and what should the result of those programs be in terms of net new names and MQLs and top of the funnel activity and brand awareness and share of voice and Gartner ratings, et cetera. So it's a whole very complex job that marketing has, no question, right? And the tools they have to plan around that are all sort of pocketed, maybe allow you to plan your ad spend and think about the results, but not a holistic budgeting. So they go over to Planful and they say, hey, can you guys help us plan this? And we say, guys, we predominantly plan in general ledgers and chart of accounts and headcount. We plan in the language of finance. So the Planful saw this disconnect and went out and found a marketing planning tool to now integrate within Planful. And that company was called Plana, which is kind of hilarious. It was a Boston company. The Planner became Plana. But the idea was that it's a marriage made in heaven, right? For marketers out there, they can now plan in the language of marketing, which automatically then translates into the language of finance. You keep your leads and campaigns, guys, and it'll cascade into our demand generation general ledger account, et cetera. And I think of all that as being upstream of what you two vendors do, right? So Sid then has to go execute against the tools that are in that marketing budget. You plan at the vendor level, and Sid and his team will help you optimize the result of those transactions with those vendors. And Carlos is all the way down at the very rubber meets the road moment of the cash flow. When does it leave? When does it come in? How do we speed that up or slow that down or make the right decisions around contract terms, dunning notices, et cetera? So sorry, I got a little bit out of control there. You can tell I care about this one, Carlos, and I could go on and on. So let me just stop.
You're middle name cash, man. I love it. Sid, yeah, tell us more about your end too. I can't think of especially now, it's kind of funny. As soon as ChatGPT happened, and then the SVB situation happened, I was like, oh man, if phishing people ever had a field day, it's now, right? I could just imagine all these people sitting there with ChatGPT creating really creative sequences to let people know that their bank information has changed because their SVB account went off, offline and all that sort of stuff. And it's just, we live in that kind of world now, right? So I was curious, what you're seeing, from your end, how you're helping folks, from all these perspectives.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, when it's not like growth, everybody wants to keep growing, right? It's not like nobody wants to ever stop. So, I'll just give you an example, right? Very similar private equity backed organization. They had to grow through acquisitions, right? So they acquired 3 companies in the last, year or so since we've been working with them. But Dan, you know this as well, Carlos, from your time in M&A, the ROI on the deal is what is important, right? It's how quickly can I actually pay it back? And so what now customers are getting really smart about is, hey, just their SaaS spend line item and the overlap in their SaaS tools across these acquisitions was so significant that they could actually pull out so much juice that they could drop their ROI for 3 months. So a 3-month drop in ROI, just their payback on that particular deal is massive, right? And from just a number standpoint. So it went from a 14-month payback to say less than 12-month, right? Which is incredible just because of the optimization that they could achieve. But those are just simple things that we see some customers actually get really smart about today. The other piece is just on risk mitigation as well, right? We see a bunch of when customers buy a particular tool, they kind of forget about it, right? And somebody else uses it, they leave the organization, but then after that, when it comes up for renewal, you have no idea what's actually happened at that particular point. So the context of why the tool was bought, everybody wanted to cancel tools, everybody wanted to drop their spend when all of these crises happened in the last year. But the smart ones also realized that I need these tools to keep working, but I have no context into why I actually bought this in the first time, and I have no context why I'm actually renewing it, and how much do I need to renew for, and how many licenses do I need to renew for? All of that good information, right? What I've realized is there's just context into why the decision was made in the first time is the key to actually making these decisions as well. So when you actually have to optimize cost across the board, or when you need to actually say, hey, listen, this is the amount of cost that I actually have to remove from this, it becomes really crucial to have all of that context. And that's context that we can actually provide in one single place as well, right? Inside SpendFlow. So that's a good piece of what some of our customers are actually seeing as well.
That's really cool. Yeah. When I listen to you guys, I remember a couple of anecdotes. It's kind of interesting. Like, so we work with Mike Maples from Floodgate pretty closely. He's one of our early investors. And he always has these funny stories. He was telling us about script writers in Hollywood and what makes a blockbuster. And he said that it's always one of two things, that you're addressing a hidden fantasy or a hidden anxiety. So like I went down this rabbit hole and I interviewed like a bunch of CFOs to try and understand what their fantasies or anxieties were. And it was really interesting. Like on the anxiety, oh, by the way, and like a hidden fantasy is way better than a hidden anxiety. Like, it's like, selling, that's why people who sell software to sales teams have it so easy, right? Versus us who sell to like finance teams, right? But like the hidden fantasy was interesting is like one guy literally said like, man, I wish I could manage my finance or cash flow from, a beach in Hawaii on my iPad. I was like, well, that's pretty cool. But then another guy was like, like, man, like, my role, I feel like I can't do what I want to do because I have to set the example for the rest of my organization, right? Like, how can I, and their anxiety was like, how can I say yes to myself for something I want to buy when I'm saying no to everyone else, right? Like, so it's like really interesting to see that. But like what I found after talking to them a little bit more is like visibility, like this timing of like visibility into what's going to happen with the workflow to actually execute it, like can make you like actually like move beyond being the department of no surprises, if you will, and that like can unlock this ability to like focus more on like this potential area, like that agility, which is like at the end of the day, I mean, we were just talking about it before, like, there's like a small difference, but it's a huge change in mindset and what happens between like playing to not lose and playing to win, right? And I feel like nothing gives you that confidence more than like knowing your cash flow. At least as a, Sid, you tell me, like as a founder, Dan as a CFO, like transmitting that to the rest of your organization, like when you're like, look, my runway goes out like more than 24 months, like my cash flow is solid, like all this sort of stuff, like you can do things like even help folks, right? Like HubSpot during the pandemic, like delayed billing to all of their, a lot of their partners to help them out, right? Because cash was tight. Like we can do things at Tesorio, like, hey, you know what? We realize you're in a hole right now and you need to fix your AR and your cash inflows. We'll delay billing for like 4 months, or something like that but let's fix this. And then because of the solution we're putting in place, which is going to be there in like less than 30 days, you'll be able to pay us. Like, don't worry. Like, but you can do that because you understand your cash flow, but you can't even play offense like that if you don't understand your cash flow, right? So it's kind of interesting when you think about, again, to me, this ties back to what you said at the beginning, Dan, like, the CFO just being able to like, help play, and being the point guard, as you were saying, Sid, so those are like practical ways I see things like really having an impact.
We should change the name of the webinar to how to move to Hawaii and do your job on an iPad. Like,
yeah, I wish I'd been the one who said it, but a CFO.
Just hold on.
Yeah.
We are not going to move on from this, Carlos, because you said the most interesting thing we discussed in our half hour on this webinar is this concept of the hidden fantasy, hidden anxiety. Now we're getting into psychology, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
That was Mike Maples who shared that insight with me, but yeah, I wish I could play them.
What a genius concept for any business, right? You're getting to the higher order reasons behind people's actions. So what patterns? I mean, I think it's actually pertinent to this concept of optimizing spend and cash flow is what were the patterns you uncovered in your conversations around finance and accounting's hidden anxieties and hidden passion? Was it passions? Hidden
anxieties and fantasies is what
fantasy, even better. Yeah. So what were some of the patterns if you've got them at your fingertips?
I'll ground it. Yeah, I'll ground it in like what we do, right? And some of this is also influenced. I don't know if I really recommend this book called The Qualified Sales Leader by John McMahon, right? Like he's like a 4-time public company CRO. Like you maybe become a CRO and take one company public. He did it like 4 times, right? Like this guy is the man. And he always talks about on this area, Dan, he talks about above the noise business reasons. Like there's business objectives and there's technical objectives. And almost all conversations get stuck at the technical reasons, but there's like, the business level reason, which is this like anxiety fantasy level that really matters. And he always ties it back to revenue, risk, and profitability. Like almost everything that's going to have an impact is going to, at that level, is going to impact revenue, risk, or profitability, right? And so I can talk about, our experience, on the AR front, for example. Like whenever I talk to our sales reps and they're like, I'm like, why are they buying? And they're like, oh, they want to improve their DSO. They want to get out of Excel. They want a digital transformation and they want automation. I'm like, nah, I don't buy it. Like, ask them again, right? They ask why. It's like you have to ask why like an uncomfortable number of times. And like, some of the things I've found that are like just next level, right? I'll give you an example. Won't name names. CFO of a publicly traded company that we would all know, if I shared, nice tech company, billions in the bank, awesome, awesome business. But their rule of 40 is based on, so rule of 40, right? Like your growth rate plus your some measure of profitability margin being 40 or more, right? They, a lot of unprofitable but public companies use their free cash flow margin instead of their EBITDA margin or their net margin, right? They use free cash flow margin. For them, hitting a rule of 40 predictably without having all cash flow decisions wait till the last week of the quarter, right? To figure out, do I prepay rent for 3 months or do I hold back all payments to my non-critical vendors? That rule of 40 has a massive impact on their market cap, right? If they miss that, it's massive. At that point, that CFO is not talking about like, is my Dunning letter going to be like automated? Can my system sync 3 times a day versus 6 times a day? Dan, we might've talked about that at one point, right? But like, like they're not looking at that sort of stuff. They're like, I'm looking at market cap, right? Like another one is you alluded to it, like PE-backed companies, especially, right? They've got, a lot of them have debt that, it was an LBO, leveraged buyout. So it brought on debt to buy the company and they've got debt service. Many people are carrying debt right now. Nice sized companies. I'm not talking about small ones like us, like pretty big companies carrying debt at like 10%, 8, 9, 10%. And they're looking at like, okay, they've got decisions to make. Like some every quarter have to choose, are they going to go for a monthly or a quarterly debt service that quarter? Right? Some have to say like, am I going to repay debt early to save on interest expenses or am I not? Right? Or, do I need to draw? And like, God forbid you draw when you weren't supposed to, your PE sponsor is going to cut your, your head off. Right? And so all of these things, that's above the noise anxiety, if you know what I mean, versus like, oh, like how do I apply a tag and how do I make an assignment? Does that make sense? Like those are those like next level things. They're hard to get to, and it's almost uncomfortable. Like the number of times you have to ask why, or like keep asking the question like a different way. But you can get to those. There's like a bunch of others I could dig into, but those are just some examples, Dan, to answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, what you said, this concept of above the noise, it resonates with me. I mean, if I had to answer that question myself, from the role of a CFO or from the role of a VP finance or a controller, or even an accounting manager or finance manager, it's unique in the business, right? Because if you ask a sales a rep or manager what their hidden anxiety is, they'll say like, having the worst quarter ever or whatever, or losing the biggest deal. And hidden fantasy would be something along the opposite, right? Like blowing it out, going to club, getting AE of the year, getting hired by Google because of that or whatever. But finance and accounting, it's all company-wide implications. And so my hidden anxiety as a CFO is being the single reason the company goes bankrupt. Like there's nothing worse, right? That would be the absolute pariah status in the world of finance. And look, I frankly could be the reason. Like if I screwed up the wrong thing, it's a non-zero chance in this career in finance that you could be the reason. Carlos, your VP Max probably feels the same way. You make the wrong planning assumption, you miss the wrong thing, you don't capitalize the business correctly, you could go under. And the hidden fantasy is sort of the opposite. In finance, you don't get a lot of recognition until something bad happens, and then it's the wrong kind of recognition. but being acknowledged as a key reason the business either survives or thrives is, sad to say, that's your hidden fantasy. It's not even that exciting, right? It's just acknowledgement. And so I think about it this way, Carlos, this whole concept of everything we talked about today, the reason I latched onto your hidden fantasy, hidden anxiety is it all kind of trickles down from a tech concept to those, or goes upstream to those two concepts. So you ought to buy tech that allows you to avoid your hidden fantasy or realize your hidden fantasy or avoid your hidden anxiety. And, like I'll go to Tesorio again, right? And I promise I should be talking more about Planful, which also does this for me. But Tesorio allows me to feel better about my hidden anxiety of the business running out of cash or breaking a covenant because I planned moved the wrong cash the wrong place. And I'm in it daily because of that. I know that this morning I saw we're at 65% of our weekly collections goal. I feel okay about that starting a Thursday, right? Friday's always our biggest collections day due to AP runs. So I feel good about that. If it was at 30%, I would go make an adjustment to avoid my hidden anxiety of ending, the quarter with too little cash or something like that.
Yeah.
And awesome. I want to hear Sid on your end. You're right there. Like nothing is more scary to CFO or to me as a CEO than like spend going out when it shouldn't. Like it's like prospect theory, right? Like every dollar gained, like the magnitude of joy from a dollar gain is always less than the magnitude of pain from like a dollar loss. Yeah. So like if $10,000 went out to the wrong person, it's gonna make it to the top way more than even if like $100,000 is like 3 weeks late getting paid, right? Like you're there. You're like, tell us about this, because like.
So I was just alluding to the point that Dan actually had was very similar, right? Like Dan, you made this point before to me as well, where in order to get to the higher order pieces, a lot of the bases had to get covered, right? Like you said, like, hey, I'll complete mine, but I would love to hear your thought on that as well, on that particular piece where just making sure that job gets done before you move to the higher order thinking is super crucial. And I'm guessing that's where a lot of the anxiety actually comes from for finance leaders as well. Just making sure, like you mentioned, just getting your, I forgot the 3 pieces that you said you had to get right, which is your basic accounts, I think your payables. Well, can you just?
Yeah, I would just say kind of think about it like things like compliance and cash flow, right? And those two things can be related. Sometimes cash flow is a compliant matter if you have covenant. I think about it this way, Sid. You teed it up very nicely. This concept of higher order, like as the role of the CFO has evolved and the conversation around finance and accounting has shifted. You've got a lot more people saying this is a sexier job. It's more strategic, more forward looking. But, they kind of forget that it still requires the base minimum of compliance and cash flow and tax and reporting and all these things. They didn't go away. But, I think I wrote a piece for this, I think for CFO Dive, just this concept of it's hard, especially for CFOs who didn't come up the chain of corporate finance or corporate accounting. Even let's say you came up through FP&A and you may or may not have a CPA, but you know next to nothing about tax. You know next to nothing about filing or establishing whether or not you have nexus in a state and working with whoever, Avalara, whoever, to get registered and remit tax, right? You have to rely on other people, experts, but you have to be conversant in it yourself. And so it's a really unique job in that no one cares if you're doing that, right? No one is going to pat you on the back and say, great job with your sales and use tax and great job optimizing our GST. But if you screw it up, you will absolutely get hung out to dry. Right. And so like Sid, that's how I think about it is you've got to do the blocking and tackling stuff. And you also have to at least have a story around and progress around the higher order stuff. And that's the sexier stuff of strategic planning and data curation and dashboards for the execs and, decision support and all that.
And it actually makes my next point as well. Like my greatest anxiety, like you said, Carlos, is paying for something that I don't want. And I'm actually locked in that auto renewal that hit my account, which is like, oh no, now I'm liable to pay for it and I don't have a choice at all to get out of it. that's the thing that causes me the most amount of anxiety, because I'm like, I'm paying for something that I don't even use, right? Like, it's just like,
Yeah.
honestly, the anxiety over that is like the most painful thing. And most of the reason why, like you said, I do the same thing with our reps, and I ask them, they always come back and tell me, what does a prospect actually want? They say visibility. I'm like, wait, what do they mean actually by visibility? What is the higher order thing that they actually really need? That higher order piece eventually ends up being, they're really anxious about all of the spend that all their different departments are using, where like all these tools that they actually have, are they actually using it? When is my actual renewal coming up? Because I'm just getting invoices, but I don't know where the hell my contract is, right?
Yeah.
So the anxiety around that and the process, the trigger at which they come and say book a demo with SpendFlow is probably when an auto renewal got triggered without them knowing. That's how I actually map it back. But that's it's funny because, like, honestly, that's like the piece that inspired me to start SpendFlow was an auto renewal.
That's amazing. That's cool. I didn't know that part. Yeah, I do want to open it up. We're at about 15 minutes away. Like, open up to the audience to see if folks have any questions. There's a chat functionality right there at the bottom, and folks can it's Q&A functionality as well. If folks want to ask some questions. If not, I've got some fun ones we can dig into in terms of everyone loves to talk about generative AI these days, right? So we of course have to talk about that topic.
Yeah.
See, all right, we'll wait and see. All right. So, one question for you all is, if we think about this, right, like there's like more innovation coming. We spent some time talking about, fintech, and obviously there's, the impact, like you were just saying, there's like table stakes stuff. Like you have to do the job at the end of the day. There's like a basic job that has to get done. But there are cool things now, right, coming out on the generative AI front. Like what are you all thinking? What are you all most excited about from a tech perspective in finance?
Yeah. I can go first as well, because I'm seeing this. I'm seeing this across the board, primarily because we buy SaaS for a living for our customers. So I think the lowest hanging fruit that I see CFOs getting really, really excited about is just pure contract scanning, right? Like this, your OCR has existed for years, but the cost of OCR and also like your AI being able to actually get those contracts with read with a high sense of accuracy, right? Like, so the cost has actually dropped about, I think the last I read was the cost dropped about 20x because of AI, and then the accuracy is now improved at least 20x as well at the same time. So I think I'm seeing that across the board, and a lot of the Office of CFO tech stack, wherever there's a document that's involved, just pulling those documents into custom fields or fields automatically is becoming table stakes now. And I'm seeing that happen across we did it across our portfolio, across our customer base. We launched our first AI feature. It's called Smart Scan, which allows us to actually do this for all SaaS contracts. SaaS pricing is not simple. So actually getting that SaaS pricing done in an automated fashion was key. I think that's the piece that really excites. I see a lot of finance leaders get really excited about, because data is the problem, right? And when data is in like PDFs, it's really hard. That's something that I'm seeing as well. And the other piece is I'm seeing a lot of amazing AI applications and integrations between systems as well. Like now it's table stakes. Like if you need to go live with integrations, it's like literally the AI can read the documentation and build the integration for you for a lot of these tools. So if a SaaS vendor comes and tells you that he doesn't have that integration, they should be able to do it for you pretty quickly as well now. So that's another thing that I'm actually, those two pieces where I see a lot of overlap, especially for the office of the CFO.
That's cool. Yeah, just a small anecdote to echo what you just said. Just to see what we could do. Like I took 20 minutes on ChatGPT, and I copy pasted an order form from a customer, and I asked it to give me back a JSON field with a billing schedule. I didn't like format anything. I literally copied the Word doc and pasted the text as it was, and it only took me 20 minutes of tweaking the prompt to get it to do that. which is kind of cool when you think about, you know, the structuring the data, as you were saying, like from these documents. Hey, Dan, we got a question for you. Someone asked, you know, what's been the most surprising change that you are now expected to manage as CFO? Is there anything that you really weren't expecting to change, to have land on your plate?
Yeah, surprise has been the name of the game from a macro perspective. So I think I perceive that question kind of taking two angles, right? So in terms of the tactical question, you know, I did not expect, for example, to be managing legal, the legal function. You know, when I started out and got my CPA and then shifted into private equity and investing, it just wasn't something that was on my radar that I might end up managing legal. And I'm lucky to have a great general counsel and fantastic legal team. And you know, it's all about knowing what you don't know when you're doing that and providing the right support. And I think CFOs everywhere are experiencing this. You know, I've had HR roll up to me, I've had IT roll up to me. And so, you know, like someone earlier, I think it was you, Sid, mentioned the more COO nature of the role. In terms of the macro, you know, the nature of surprises is that you can't expect them. But, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the banking crisis were two, you know, you usually only have one of those type of things in an entire career. And we had two of them in 3 years. And so I did not expect to be at, you know, the elevated interest rates, did not expect to be scrambling to you know, rejigger my banking infrastructure, and did not expect to be asking questions like, you know, do we need an office? So, you know, this hopefully I answered the question. I don't know. We could go a long time on that one alone.
Yeah. So Dan, what about you, man? Like, are there any surprising things on the tech front that you're seeing that are, you know, getting you pretty jazzed? I
guess the question,
like every vendor is going to launch, you know, some automated email writing functionality, you know, like that's like table stakes at this point. If you have any kind of communication, it's there, right? Or like, let me query my data with natural language, you know, it's interesting to see, you know, those are like pretty consistent things, but kind of what's like novel? Like what have you seen that's like, whoa, that was different. I didn't expect that.
Mm-hmm. I think the original question was, what are you most excited about? And sure. In terms of, and so I think, look, there's no question that Gen AI has made this conversation more interesting in terms of the kind of near term, medium term, and long term exciting elements of tech. And so I'll focus there on what Gen AI has changed. But just to be clear, you know, AI and machine learning have been around for a while. I mean, Planful launched our Predict suite of capabilities, which are AI capabilities for budgeting, forecasting, and analysis in 2021, which sounds quaint. But what changed the game was Gen AI and large language models really taking hold at the end of last year. So I'll stay there. So what I'm most excited about are, I'll just stick with the near term, is I think the easiest and quickest value out of Gen AI we're going to get is exactly what you said, Carlos. It's applications, vendors like the three of us on this call who introduce AI capabilities into the existing platform to make the lives of accounting professionals, finance professionals easier and make them more effective and efficient, right? And so I'll give you an example. I mean, Carlos, clearly your platform is an absolute candidate for AI with all the communications, et cetera. But in Planful, I think about it two ways. Number one will be, so much of a finance job is forensic. So you mentioned querying your data, Carlos. You imagine a chatbot in Planful, which, you know, I'm not making any promises, but let's just say, stay tuned. You imagine a chatbot in Planful where you can ask, how many reps did we have last year in the UK and what was their attainment against quota, right? Oh, bang, I just saved you probably 15 minutes. And you can take that to the end user and actually take FP&A out as the middleman so they can go do their job of pushing the envelope forward rather than, you know, bird dogging a dozen questions a day. And so there's that forensic nature of querying your own data, Carlos, which you touch on. And the second one is execution, being able to say to the system, you know, spin up a new budget scenario, but take bookings down 5% and find for me a commensurate offsetting lever to pull to stay at the same free cash flow. don't touch sales capacity, that kind of thing. And then you can see a scenario spinning up, bang, bang, bang. Here are the key assumptions. Again, that probably saves 2 hours, Carlos. And so I'm just thinking about things like this that don't feel suddenly so far away from us.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. It's the scenarios you just talked about, the ones that Sid was sharing that get me most excited about as well. And Sid, it's funny, we didn't talk about it beforehand, but my co-founder, if he listens to this, is gonna laugh, because since 2014, he and I have had this like ongoing conversation about the day when computers could integrate, the systems could integrate to each other on their own. And when like ChatGPT came out, like the first thing we talked about was like, it's not possible.
Yeah.
Like, put an API doc through an LLM, have it learn how to, interact, understand the schema. And basically then what if you had two of them, interacting, one trained on one API, one trained on another, and now they could talk to each other. Like I think the world's going to get pretty exciting pretty soon.
Yeah. I actually had another point to add as well, which is like a lot of our customers, right? Like Carlos and Dan, like this is more a question to both of you. A lot of the CFOs we work with, right? Like, the question that they have is, at what point do they actually look for like a cash flow management solution, right? Like at what scale or at what point would they look at that? And at the same time, Dan, at what scale does like an FP&A solution actually make sense, right? What's that trigger point where you see customers should actually start using an FP&A tool or a cash flow management tool?
Carlos, you lead us off, and then I'll answer.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's like different parts of cash flow that people start to address at different times, right? What's interesting, I think generally, like, you spend money before you make money.
Yeah.
So people that's why I'm always jealous of folks like you. Like, you're top of mind, right? Like, I mean, we started off with Bill.com way back when, just because our accountants told us to do it. But like, we got QuickBooks and Bill.com and Expensify, like all things around money going out the door and tracking it somehow, right? So it usually starts there, I'd say, and that's from day zero, right? But like, once you have some customers and you've got, I'd say at least, one person looking, or your aging start to creep up, right? Mm-hmm. That's, I'd say, is when, folks start to look at the next part, like AR, right? And then putting it all together, that's something that I think it does come a little later, but it also depends on the industry, right? So in tech, right, like everything I just said holds, right? Like AR, AP, all right, put it together, right? Everyone now, all together now. But if you're in like any industry that's managing physical goods, like you live and die by your cash conversion cycle, right? Mm-hmm. If you're PE backed and you've got debt, well, first off, if you're PE backed, you're already later stage anyway, typically. Yeah. So that kind of by default answers that question a little bit. But if you're managing physical goods, you live and die by like your cash conversion cycle. So understanding DSO, DPO, and how you like have your working capital literally impacts how much inventory you can buy, how fast you can grow, and all that sort of thing. So I'd say it depends, right? But if you press me on it, like I'd say like AR functionality typically around like 25 to 50 million in revenue, right? Like cash flow functionality probably a little bit later, like 75 to 100, or maybe a little over 100. Definitely when you're the reason I say 75 to 100 is like when you're getting ready to go public, cash flow, because of what we talked about earlier, right? Especially in the tech sector, you're usually not profitable when you're public as a tech company. Some exceptions exist out there. So cash flow is paramount. So a long answer, but as always,
it's always important as well to get that. And Dan, what about you?
I know we're coming up against time, but it's a similar answer. I mean, it's nuanced, right? It depends on the industry, the complexity, but I like Carlos's framework. So for our tool, specifically even just the planning and reporting piece of it, I'd say 25 million revenue, maybe 10 million a spend, maybe 50 employees. There are a bunch of different ways to look at it, but spreadsheets and in QuickBooks will get you up to a certain point very well. And things will then start to vibrate, break. Your investors, your board will be anxious. And that's the time to start thinking about building for the future on the right platform.
Makes sense. I think before we leave, Carlos, if I'm not mistaken, we have a quick poll for the audience.
Yeah, let's do it. We got a minute left. Let's launch that poll. Excellent. Thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the Q&A. It was awesome. Thank you, Sid, for hosting us. Dan for joining and for lobbing some questions back at me, guys. That was nice of you. Unnecessary. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Carlos and Dan, for joining us as well. As always, this is an amazing conversation. I leave knowing a little bit more every single time I speak to you guys. So I'm excited.
Awesome.
Agree. Insightful conversation. Thank you for having me.